Hello. This video is about responsive web design and how we accomplish it. So I'm going to talk about 4 specific things in this video. I'm going to talk about the Viewport meta tag, which is required in all your HTML files or documents. I'm going to talk about how to use max width 100%, not only for images, but also for other items that you might have on your HTML page. I'm going to talk about media queries and how to write them and how they work. And of course, I'll demonstrate that. And I'm also going to talk about breakpoints, what they are, and how we choose the vital measurement, because breakpoints are based on a width, and you need to know how to choose that width. So the very first thing you need to know about responsive design is that we have a new HTML tag or element that we must include in the head of our HTML file. So up until now in this course, you have not used this, and from now on you must, because this Viewport meta tag, which is described in the book, and you can Google it and you can copy it from anywhere. These are the correct settings. This is the correct position. It makes the page scale for mobile instead of shrinking down to a tiny little page that nobody can actually read because it's too small. So this tag is required, it is necessary, and the position of the tag is important. We always have the doc type, then we have HTML, then we have head. Then the first thing in the head has to be the meta charset tag, which we have been using, and the second thing has to be the meta viewport tag. And after that, you can have your title and link tags and so forth. But get this straight now, and from now on, always include it. So let's get started with a very simple page. It has a full width header at the top, and then it has a single article about manatees with one image, a caption, and a few paragraphs. So right now, the paragraphs span the entire width of the page, no matter how wide it is, because we have not put any constraints on that. And of course, this is terrible. It looks quite ugly. So the first thing we're going to do is constrain that width. So if we look at the HTML, you'll see that below the H1, everything we see on the page has been wrapped in an article element. So the logical thing to think about if you're thinking, I want to set some kind of width constraint on what I'm seeing on my page, you have to think about containers first. So I've just shown you this big container on the page, and I actually don't want to change the width of the heading at the top. So I'm going to choose to change article. So I'll go into my CSS for this, and I look first to see, have I put any styles on the article yet? Because if I already have a rule for article, I want to use the same thing. I don't want to have 2 rules for article, because that could cause problems by having one thing override another thing, right? So I don't have an article, so I will put article right here. So here I have a brand new CSS rule, and I want to constrain the width. Now, if I put something on it like this, that would be terrible, because the page would not be flexible. Pixels are not relative, they're not flexible, they would not help me if the page got narrower. And I'll show you how that works. So I save and I reload, and yeah, the article is now narrower. The margins on the left side are terrible, but let's not worry about that for a second. What happens when I am on a narrower device, like a tablet or a phone? This is what happens if your width is not flexible. So because I only have the one column on the page, I'm going to set this to max width. And I'm going to keep it at 600 pixels because by making that simple change, max-width, this design will become flexible. And I save and reload to show you that. It looks the same before we start moving the page. But now as I move the page, now notice the image is not flexing, but the text is. All the text is flexing really well. Still have a margin problem. We'll fix that. But what about that image? The image is not flexing at all. That is because even though we've put a max width on the article, the image has to also have a max width. So I look and see, have I put any styles on IMG? No, not yet. So I do that next. And I also need to give that image a display block declaration because images are inline by default, and this does not work well without display block. So 100%, save and reload. And now what's going to happen is, look at that, beautiful. So everything is flexing in and out. Now there's one other thing. Apart from the left margin, which is non-existent, really you don't want this huge empty space on the right-hand side of the page. If this is all you've got on your page, you really probably want to center this. You don't want to make it wider, you just want to make it always appear in the center. So there's a really easy way to do that. And that is on the article, remember that's our container, we put margin auto. Right now this affects all four margins, top, right, bottom, and left, which is okay. If you wanted to put something else on the top and bottom, you could do it like this, but it's okay to have it on all four sides like this. So margin auto, I save and I reload, and not only is the article perfectly centered, it's perfectly centered no matter what. Now we still have a problem with the left and right margins being non-existent at a small size. But at anything a little larger, this is a really flexible page and it works great thanks to two things, right? Margin auto on the whole container and max width 100% on the image, and a max width that gives us a good line length for readability on the container itself, the article. Now, the one last thing that remains to be done is what are we going to do when things are like this and we don't want these left and right edges of the article to be touching the sides of the window. It just looks terrible. It looks cramped. It doesn't look professional. So how do we deal with that? Well, we use a media query. So we want the media query to affect this only when it gets to a width smaller than about here. And how do we find out, well, what is that width? I mean, how do we even know what that could possibly be? What we do is we open up our developer tools. So in the Chrome browser, you open the View menu, you go to Developer, and you say Developer Tools, and it will either appear down here on the bottom of your screen, or you can make it go to the side of the screen, either the right side or the left side. So I'm going to make it go to the right for this page. And now when I am flexing in and out, I'm dragging in and out, look at that number in the top right-hand corner of the window. It's telling me how wide and how tall the page is. So the first number is width, and what I want to see is when does that margin start to look ugly? And it's right about here at 600, 625. I'm going to choose a wider measurement, and I'm going to do it in pixels. So I'm going to go to the bottom of my CSS file. That's important. You must put media queries below everything else. They have to be at the bottom. And I'm going to first put in my media query rule. And it's important to know that when you start writing your media query, it should look like this. And then in between, where my cursor is on line 53, you need to also include your curly braces for any selector that you put in there. So it's a common mistake for beginners to accidentally leave out one or more of the curly braces, and that makes your media query not work. So I need to put margins on my article. And so like any CSS selector, I need to have a pair of curly braces following the word article, right? That's my selector, and the rule is inside, and I'm just going to put one rem all the way around. That's my entire media query right now. And I save, and I reload, and what happens now when I make the window more narrow? I have a margin. See that margin? It goes all the way around, it's on the left and right, and it doesn't harm at all the wider width. When the page is wide, nothing is changed, nothing is harmed, but when it gets narrow, it gets that nice margin to make it look good. We have one more problem though that we need to address with our media query, and that is that our margins on the left side now do not match. And that's a problem. It's a design problem. Any designer would say, ugh, that left side looks really awful because the heading at the top in the black background does not align with the heading below it and the text below it. So we can fix that in our media query also by making a new rule for our, let's see, is it the header or is it the H? It's an H1. Okay, so the H1 has a padding on it of 2 rems, and that's what we need to fix. We need to say, hey H1, have a different padding so that you match with the margin that's on everything else. So that would be exactly the same, 1 rem. Very important, not M, but rem, a root M, and we save and we reload, and that fixes that margin. And this will be especially efficient on a phone because now we've put less space around that big heading at the top. So it's important to check those things. And another thing, you'll notice that in my H1, the main rule for the H1 at the top of the CSS, it's got 4 things in it, but only 1 needed to change. So when I go into my media query, I do not put all 4 things because only 1 changes. So it's important to understand that in your media query, you only change what has to change for any element that you put in the media query. Similarly for the article, I'm only changing 1 thing, even though our article has 2 things defined. Now, for a very different example, we have 3 elements, and on a wide screen, we want them to be side by side. So we did this with grid. I'll show you the CSS and the HTML in a moment, but the problem that we're going to find is if the screen is narrower, first they're going to start to look bad because the columns are just going to be too narrow. It's going to seem silly, right? But then there's going to come a point where they won't even flex at all anymore, and they get stuck and you can't see content. So how do we account for that? What we really want to do is at some point we want 3 columns to become 2 and the whales to drop down below, and at the narrowest width we want single boxes stacked on top of each other. So this is quite easy to do if you have used CSS Grid, and that's what we're going to look at next. So in the HTML, I've got a grid container and all 3 columns are in it, and they are each an article. So big grid container, and in it, 3 articles, one for whales, one for dolphins, one for manatees, etc. How is this laid out in my CSS? I've got normal stuff up until here's the grid container. So I have display grid, naturally, that's what makes it go into a grid. I've got 3 columns, and I've made them equal size by using this value, repeat, parenthesis 3, and then 1 FR. FR stands for fraction. This is a common way to set up a grid. So they'll each be an equal width no matter what. For rows, because I only have 1, I just put in auto, so I don't care how tall they are, the text will determine the height. And let's see, I put a max width on of 1280 pixels so that it doesn't sprawl too wide on a really wide screen like a big desktop computer. For the grid items, remember that each one is an article, so this affects every single one of the blue boxes on the page. So they've got a border, a background, a padding, margin. They've got no special grid things at all. All the grid things are in the grid container, which is a div with the ID grid-container. So how am I going to make this start to flex? Well, at the bottom of my page, I am going to write a media query. But how do I know how wide I want it to be? For that, I'm going to open up my Chrome Developer Tools, and there they are. And in this case, if they are showing at the side, it's going to be a problem for what I'm trying to do. So in this case, I'm going to switch my Chrome Developer Tools to the bottom of the screen like this. And I'm also going to make them really, really small because I don't really need to look at them. I just need to have the pixel width showing up for me, as you saw in a previous video. So what I want to do is find out, when do the 3 columns start to look silly? When do they start to look too narrow? And I think they're starting to now. When would I like it to go to 2 columns instead of 3? So based on what I'm seeing here, I think I'm going to pick a width of about 950 pixels. So you notice I'm not choosing a device. I'm choosing a width at which my layout starts to look bad. So I set up my media query, and then inside it, I'm going to need to make it go to 2 columns instead of 3. And just a note, Robbins, in her book, suggests that you do this with M's. I think for beginners, it's going to be easier for you to use pixels, PX, because of what I just showed you with the Chrome Developer Tools, right? You'll be able to see at exactly which point does the layout start to look dumb. And what do we need to change to get the columns to get it to go to 2 columns? Well, in your grid container, that's what we're going to change. We're going to change something in this selector, but what? We don't need to change that. We do need to change columns. We don't need to change the rows. We don't need to change this. So again, we're only going to change the one thing, and we don't want to put anything else into the media query. Don't forget your final closing bracket. We don't need this. All we need is this, and this is so easy with grid. If we want to change it from 3 columns to 2, all we do is change that number. And I save, and I will reload over here. And so right now I'm at 975, 970. Let's go. So what happens at 950? Is that beautiful? That's awesome. So it'll work perfectly. Even if we had 10 of these boxes, everything would just work beautifully because of grid. Now we still have a little problem when we get narrower, because imagine having 2 columns of text on a phone. So once again, we're looking for, when does it start to look really stupid? It already looks stupid. I think we need to go wider than that. This might be okay. That might be okay. Right? So when does it look really, really dumb? I'm thinking around 600 pixels is when it starts to look really bad. So I am just going to copy this whole media query, copy, put it below, change 950 to 600, and change 2 to 1. Save my CSS, reload, and when does it go to 1? Right there. So Grid makes making media queries really a beautiful experience, and I've still got my 3 after the 2. I'm going to go to 3, and they flex in size because of that wonderful value for Grid, the 1 FR, which is 1 fractional unit. So by having 1, 1 FR here, 2, 1 FR here, and 3 up in our main one, right? Repeat 3, 1 FR. We get 3 equal columns, 2 equal columns, or 1 equal column with no stress at all. Now, one last thing. You'll notice that I have been using max width, and I used max width in both of my media queries in this example. What if you used min width? So it's important for you to understand the difference. I am using max because I am going down to 950 from a wider width. And then I'm going down from 950 to 600. So if I were to use a min width, it means I'm going up. And I'm going to demonstrate that by changing my 2-column media query to min. So what this means is that when the container hits 950, it's going to change to 2. Change to 2 in which direction? Well, min means when it gets bigger than 950, it will become 2. So how's that going to play out? I'm going to save and reload. Right now I'm full screen. When I reload, it becomes 2. Because that min width is now in effect. It's affecting, even though my first CSS is all about 3 columns, the min width is coming into effect. And we won't see the 3 unless I get more narrow than 950. But my second media query that kicks in at 600 is still in effect as a max width. And there I go to 1. So this is not a beautiful way to do it, but I'm trying to demonstrate to you that min width and max width are quite different. And even though this wasn't a good place to use min, you can see how different it is. That concludes this video about responsive design. So remember your viewport meta tag for sure. Remember how to figure out your breakpoints. Use your media queries at the bottom of your CSS and try to make your page look good for any width of screen.